The airport was loud with the sounds of rolling suitcases, announcements, and hurried footsteps, but she moved through it quietly like someone entering a temple. Her fingers clutched the boarding pass tightly, careful not to bend or lose it. Her daughter had printed it for her, with so much excitement, saying, "Ma, you're flying first class. Can you believe it?" She couldn't. She had never been on a plane before, never even sat in an airport seat for long, and now here she was 63 years old, a simple cotton curtie on her back hair, tied in a loose bun, carrying nothing but a small handbag and a wrapped lunch. People rushed past her dressed in fine clothes with rolling suitcases and wireless earphones, while she paused to read every sign twice before moving. As she walked into the aircraft, her eyes widened at the space, the lights, the seats that looked like soft beds. She stepped gently into the first-class cabin, checking her seat number again. Seat 2. Her heart beat faster. She had never even imagined sitting in a place like this. But just as she reached the seat, a tall woman in a tight uniform stepped into her path. "Can I help you, ma'am?" the attendant asked, her tone polite, but with a sharpness hidden behind the smile. "Yes, Beta, I think this is my seat," she said, holding out her ticket with a shy smile. The woman glanced at it for a brief second, then looked back at her. "Are you sure, ma'am? This is first class," she said slowly, as if the words needed extra weight. The old woman nodded. "My daughter booked it for me," she said proudly. "She saved and surprised me." The attendant's face barely changed, but her eyes narrowed, and she tilted her head slightly, then whispered something to another crew member standing nearby. The old woman was not deaf, too ugly for first class, the flight attendant said under her breath. The words stung like open flame. Her face flushed, and her shoulders tensed, but she said nothing. A few passengers nearby had started to glance over, curious. She did not know what to do, whether to sit or turn around or speak. The flight attendant reached for the ticket again, still smiling, still acting like everything was fine. But before anything else could be said, a voice spoke from behind, deep, steady, and commanding. "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" The old woman turned, and the flight attendant stepped back, her face suddenly shifting into something far less confident. A man in a dark blue blazer stepped forward, tall, with silver in his hair and calm in his voice. He looked straight at the attendant, then at the old woman. "I believe that's my mother," he said. The silence in the first-class cabin was sudden and sharp, as every eye turned toward the man in the navy blue blazer. The flight attendant took a half step back, her expression unsure, her posture now less confident than before. The old woman blinked slowly, confusion written on her face. She looked at the man standing before her, tall, broad shoulders, clean-shaven face, kind eyes that seemed to soften as he looked at her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. He stepped forward, gently placed a hand on her arm, and said again, louder, "I believe that is my mother." The attendant tried to recover herself. She forced a tight smile and said, "Of course, sir, I was just assisting her to her seat." "No, you were not," the man said quietly, but firmly. "You were mocking her, and everyone heard it." The tension in the cabin rose like a tide. A few passengers turned fully in their seats. Some even pulled out their phones. Others leaned in closer to listen. The flight attendant's cheeks flushed as she stepped back and whispered, "I will check with the captain." She turned and walked quickly down the aisle, disappearing behind the curtain. The man turned back to the old woman and smiled warmly. "You are sitting right here, Ma," he said, gently guiding her to seat 2. As she followed him slowly, still silent, still unsure. Once she sat down, he knelt beside her and spoke softly. "You don't remember me, do you?" She looked into his eyes, trying to search for something familiar, but found only a strange warmth that made her want to cry. "I was the boy in the hospital ward in room 17. You brought me food every night for weeks when my parents could not come," he said. She stared at him, her breath caught in her chest. "You remembered," she whispered. I never forgot he said I was 6, and you were the only person who spoke to me like I mattered. You used to tie my shoelaces and bring me roti wrapped in foil. Tears welled in her eyes. You were so small, she said, and always afraid of the injections. He smiled and nodded. You told me to be brave and to pray before sleep. He said I never forgot you, and now I make sure people like you are never treated like that again. She reached out and touched his face gently. But how did you know I would be on this flight? She asked. He glanced at her handbag and pulled out the boarding pass slip. My assistant saw your name on the manifest this morning, he said, and I knew it had to be you. The curtain at the front moved again, and the same flight attendant stepped back into the cabin, this time with the captain following close behind. Ma'am, and sir, is everything all right here? The captain asked. The man stood up slowly and said calmly, not yet. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a card and handed it to the captain. The name on the card made the old woman gasp quietly in her seat. The captain took the card from the man and glanced down at it. His eyes paused for a moment, then looked back up with a sudden change in expression. He stood straighter and gave a small respectful nod. Of course. Sir, please let us know if there is anything we can do to make you or your mother more comfortable. The man smiled politely and said, Thank you, Captain. The flight attendant beside him seemed to shrink by the second. Her hands folded tightly in front of her. She looked between the two men and then at the old woman still seated quietly in seat 2A. The old woman stared at the captain, then at the man, then at the card in his hand. What is this? She asked gently. The man knelt beside her again, his voice soft. My name is Arjun. She slowly nodded as if hearing the name again, pulled something from a dusty corner of memory. I started a company 15 years ago. He continued, we help people in remote areas get access to healthcare today. We run 42 hospitals across the country and 3 medical schools. She covered her mouth with her hand, and her eyes filled again with tears. But you were just a boy, she whispered. And you were just a hospital cleaner who sat beside me when no one else did, he said. His voice stayed calm, but the emotion in it touched something deep in her. The passengers nearby were still watching, but more quietly now, some with soft expressions, others, looking down. The captain turned to the flight attendant and said firmly, I will speak with you after we take off. For now, you may return to the galley. She hesitated, then turned quickly and walked away, her face pale, her steps stiff. The man stood and sat down beside the old woman in seat 2B. This seat was reserved for me. He said I moved things around so I could fly with you. But how did you know I was that same woman? She asked. Arjun reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He opened it carefully and handed it to her. She held it with trembling fingers. It was a drawing, a child's sketch done in pencil on lined notebook paper. It showed a woman in a white scarf holding a lunchbox with a little boy beside her. The old woman gasped and touched the paper gently. You kept this, she said, her voice breaking. All these years? He nodded. You were the first person to see me when I felt invisible, he said. She looked down at the picture again, her eyes blurry, then up at him with a quiet smile. I never had children, she said. He reached out and held her hand, and maybe now you do, he said. The plane began to roll forward slowly, the safety demonstration playing in the background. Passengers settled back in their seats, but the story in 2A and 2B was only just beginning. Because what the old woman did not know yet was that her life was about to change forever. The engines hummed gently as the plane lifted off the ground, and the old woman stared out the window watching the clouds come closer. She had never been this high before, not in a plane, not in life. Beside her, Arjun sat quietly, letting her have a moment to take it all in. After a few minutes, she turned to him slowly, her voice still soft. Why did you book me in first class? She asked. He looked at her and smiled gently, because you never would have booked it for yourself. You spent your whole life putting others first, he said, and I wanted to remind you what it feels like to be treated with dignity. She looked down at her hands folded in her lap and nodded slowly. I never asked for much, she said, just peace, and maybe some respect. He nodded and replied, sometimes. The ones who ask for the least to deserve the most. The flight attendant from earlier had not returned. Another younger crew member came by with a warm smile and offered her juice and a hot towel. She hesitated, then took it, and whispered, thank you. Arjun leaned closer and said, I didn't just want to thank you, I wanted to give you something. She turned to him curious, her eyebrows raised. He reached into his bag and pulled out a folder thick and bound with a soft red ribbon. What is this? She asked as he placed it in her lap. Open it. When you're ready, he said, and then turned to face forward, giving her space with trembling hands. She untied the ribbon and opened the folder. Inside were printed pages, official documents, contracts, letters, all carefully arranged. She picked up the first page and began to read. After a few lines, her breath caught in her throat. It was a deed, property in her name, a small apartment in a clean, quiet part of the city. A second page showed a monthly pension signed off by the board of Arjun's hospital group. Another letter stated she was being named as an honorary board member for her years of service and contribution to the care of patients. She looked at Arjun, her eyes wide. What is all this? She asked. His voice was quiet but clear. This is your new life, Ma. No more small rooms, no more struggling, no more being forgotten. You cleaned hospital floors for decades. You showed kindness to patients. You made a difference. She shook her head, slowly trying to speak, but no words would come. No one has ever done something like this for me, she whispered. He reached over and took her hand again. You did everything for me when I had nothing, he said. Now it's my turn. Her eyes were full, and her heart was too. The clouds outside drifted by slowly, and for once she felt like she was floating above all the years of struggle and silence. But just as she closed the folder and smiled, something inside it slid out and dropped onto her lap. It was a photograph, one she had never seen before. And what she saw in that photograph made her sit up straight, her heart suddenly racing. The photograph that fell from the folder was old, the edges curled, and the colors faded like something kept hidden for years. The old woman picked it up, slowly, trembling hands, brushing across the image, her breath catching in her throat. It showed a young woman standing outside a hospital, a bright smile on her face, her eyes filled with hope. The woman was wearing the same white scarf, the same kind eyes she had worn all those years ago in the hospital ward. But the woman in the picture was not her. This woman was younger, more vibrant, but there was no mistaking the face. She looked at Arjun, her voice shaking. Who is this? She asked. He looked at the photo and then back at her, his expression softening. That's you, he said quietly. She shook her head. No, it can't be me, she whispered, but her hands were still holding the photograph tight. I've never seen this picture before, she said, her voice rising in disbelief. Arjun reached for the photo and gently took it from her hands. I know you haven't, he said, because this picture was taken before you came to the hospital all those years ago. She stared at him, confused and unsure, before he said quietly, You don't remember, do you? Her heart began to pound in her chest. Something was wrong, something was slipping away from her grasp. This isn't possible, she whispered. Arjun sighed deeply and leaned in closer, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. The woman in the picture was your sister. She was a doctor at the hospital when you worked there as a cleaner. But she disappeared one night. No one knew where she went. The old woman's face went pale, her eyes widening as the weight of his words sank in. My sister, she whispered, my sister disappeared. Yes, he said, and I spent my life looking for answers. He paused, then added, I found you by chance years later when I started this company. I knew I had to help you, But I also knew there was more to your story than just being a cleaner. I needed to understand your past before I could give you this chance." The old woman looked down at her hands, trembling. She hadn't thought about her sister in so many years. How could she have forgotten so much? How could she have let her sister just fade away from her memory? The photo was still in her hands, and now it felt like a heavy weight, like a door opening to a room she had locked away a long time ago. Arjun watched her closely, waiting for her to speak. But the old woman's mind was racing. Her thoughts were tangled in the past, the memories she had pushed down for so long. There was one question on her mind, now more than anything else. "Where is she?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The old woman's heart raced. Her hands clenched around the photograph as she stared at Arjun, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Where is she?" she asked again, this time louder, the desperation clear in her voice. Arjun took a deep breath and leaned back in his seat, watching her carefully. "I wish I knew," he said quietly, "but I do know this: your sister was a doctor, a brilliant one." He paused for a moment, his voice low. "We found her records in the hospital archives. Her name was Neelam Kumari. She was well respected, loved by her patients and colleagues. But one night she just vanished. No note, no warning, nothing." The old woman stared at him, her mind racing with thoughts of a past she had long buried away. How could she have forgotten her sister? How could she have lived with that for so long? "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why did she leave? Where did she go?" Arjun looked at her with a sorrowful expression. "I've spent years looking into it," he said, "but all the clues led nowhere. We thought she might have left the country or been taken, but there was never any sign." "Then why didn't I know this?" she asked, tears starting to form in her eyes. "You were always at the hospital. You worked so hard. You gave everything to the patients. You never had time for yourself." Arjun's voice softened. "It's possible you blocked it out. Too much pain, too much confusion." The old woman closed her eyes and leaned back in her seat, her mind swirling with the idea that her sister was gone, and she never even knew why. All those years spent cleaning the hospital hallways, and she never once thought to ask questions. Arjun reached out and gently touched her arm. "It's not your fault," he said softly. "It wasn't your responsibility. But now we can find the truth together." The old woman turned to look at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "But how?" she asked. Arjun stood up and reached into his bag, pulling out a small black folder. He placed it in front of her. "This," he said, "is the key." She opened the folder, her hands trembling as she scanned the pages. "These are documents from the hospital archives," he said. "They show details of your sister's life at the hospital. They also show something else, a series of cryptic notes from Kumari's last months there." The old woman flipped through the papers, each word feeling like a puzzle piece falling into place. There was something hidden beneath the surface, something no one had ever noticed before. She stopped on a page and stared at the words written there. "Arjun, I need you to promise me something," she said quietly, her voice filled with urgency. "Anything," he replied. "Promise me you'll help me find her," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I need to know what happened to her. I need to know the truth." The old woman's hands shook as she held the papers in her lap. Arjun watched her closely, his eyes filled with concern. She turned each page slowly, her eyes scanning the cryptic notes left by her sister in her final months at the hospital. There was a pattern in the writing, something that didn't sit right with her, something she couldn't quite understand. Arjun waited quietly for her to speak. After what felt like an eternity, she finally looked up, her face pale and her voice trembling. "This can't be real," she whispered, but her eyes betrayed her. The doubt was fading as she pieced it together. Arjun leaned forward. "What do you mean?" he asked. Her fingers stopped on one particular page. She pointed to a note scrawled at the bottom of a report. "It says here that Kumari had started investigating something hidden inside the hospital, something no one else knew about." Arjun frowned and leaned closer to see the note. "It mentions a secret ward." he said, his voice lowering a secret ward place for patients. No one ever talked about the old woman, nodded slowly, her mind racing. It also says she was getting too close, that someone knew she was asking questions. But why didn't I know any of this? She asked, her voice cracking. Why didn't anyone tell me? Arjun paused for a moment. Before answering, it wasn't just that they didn't tell you, he said quietly. They made sure you never found out. The hospital didn't just want to hide your sister's investigation. They wanted to keep you in the dark, too. The old woman's breath caught in her throat as she absorbed his words. But why, she asked, why would they hide this from me? Arjun exhaled slowly, as if weighing his words carefully. I think your sister uncovered something dangerous. He said, something that could ruin people's lives. The hospital might have been hiding illegal experiments, or even worse things that were happening under their roof. He paused and then added, and I think your sister was getting too close to the truth. The old woman's heart pounded in her chest. The truth about her sister's disappearance was coming into sharper focus now. The hospital, where she had spent so many years working, was not what it seemed. But just as she was about to speak again, the sound of the seatbelt sign flashing on interrupted their conversation. Please return to your seats, the voice over the intercom said calmly. Arjun turned to her one last time before he sat back down in his seat. I know this is a lot to take in, he said, but we can't stop now. The secret ward your sister discovered might hold the key to everything we need to know. She looked at him with fear in her eyes. I'm ready, she said, but I need you to promise me one thing. Arjun looked at her with a calm but firm expression. Anything, he said. Promise me you won't let anyone stop us, she said, her voice shaking. I won't, he replied, his voice steady and full of determination. Then let's find the truth, she said. The plane began to descend as the old woman clutched the papers tightly in her hands, her heart still racing with the weight of what she had just learned. Arjun was sitting beside her, his gaze never leaving her face, as he quietly watched her process everything. The intercom crackled, and the flight attendants began preparing for landing. She glanced out the window, but her mind was far from the clouds outside. The truth about her sister was finally within reach, but there was still one thing that didn't add up. She turned to Arjun, her voice barely above a whisper. How do you know all this, she asked. Arjun took a deep breath and leaned in closer. I've been looking for answers for years, he said. My whole life was shaped by the mystery of your sister's disappearance. He paused before continuing. She was my mother's closest friend. She was like family to me when I was just a child. The old woman's eyes widened in shock. She looked at him in disbelief. Wait, are you saying? Yes, he said, his voice steady. I'm the son of the woman who worked beside your sister at the hospital. My mother was the one who tried to protect her. The pieces started to click in her mind now, and everything fell into place. Arjun continued. My mother knew what was happening in that hospital. She knew the experiments were happening in secret, and she tried to warn your sister, but they silenced her before she could do anything. Your sister wasn't just investigating, she was trying to expose something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. She was trying to save lives, but she paid the price for it. The old woman sat back in her seat, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. I can't believe this, she whispered. I've lived my whole life, not knowing the truth, not knowing what happened to her. And now you're telling me that the hospital I worked for, the hospital I trusted, was hiding all of this. Arjun nodded slowly. The hospital has been running this secret operation for years. He said, we've been trying to expose them for as long as I can remember. But it wasn't until recently that we discovered the truth about what really happened to your sister. He took a deep breath before continuing. The secret ward was more than just a medical facility. It was a place where they conducted experiments on the patients without their consent. They used them as test subjects for dangerous drugs and procedures. And your sister was getting too close to uncovering it all. The old woman's mind reeled with the magnitude of what Arjun was saying. They killed her, she said, her voice breaking. They killed her, Because she knew too much. Arjun nodded sadly, yes. He said that's why she disappeared. There was no way to track her down. After that, the hospital covered up everything. The old woman sat in silence for a long time, staring out the window as the plane finally touched down on the runway. Arjun looked at her one last time. We've made it. He said the truth is finally out, and no one can silence it anymore. She turned to him, her voice filled with quiet resolve. We're going to make sure this never happens again, she said. He smiled and nodded. I promise you we will do whatever it takes to bring justice to your sister and to all the others who suffered in silence.